everybody. I had a chance to do some action research over fall and winter quarter, and something that was on my mind, something that I was pretty passionate about, was the impact of ratio and group size on caregivers, children, and families. The intent behind the research was to gain insight into how we can improve circumstances for both caregivers and children by bringing awareness to any of the negative social and emotional, or basically any negative developmental effects on children or negative professional impacts that on caregivers that come from high child to caregiver ratios and large group sizes. A little bit about why I'm passionate about this, why I decided to study this, was some of the current attitudes that I see in early learning professionals, especially in management positions in Washington State child cares. There's a little bit, they demonstrate a little bit of an unawareness of the difficulty that is placed on toddler caregivers due to the Washington State ratio requirements. There's typically, the typical response from management is, she's fine, she only has 7 toddlers. And you know, that statement is not uncommon to hear, as a matter of fact, when staffing is discussed by management. The assumption being that they're in ratio, but it doesn't consider the individual needs of the children and how that impacts overall group functioning. How many one-on-ones we have, how many behaviors we have, what are the challenges. Having cared for 7 toddlers alone, I know that maintaining that active supervision protocol, health and safety standards, positive interactions while changing diapers and transitioning, serving meals and snacks, and building relationships is extremely difficult. So my research focused on the question, can process quality be impacted by strategically changing structural characteristics like ratio and group size in a toddler classroom? Our center here, of course, adheres to the Washington Administrative Code requirements to determine child enrollment and staffing numbers. In Washington State, the ratio is 1 teacher to 7 toddlers, and the age range is 12 to 29 months. The national ratio standard is 1 caregiver for every 4 toddlers, and that age range is 13 to 35 months. Those of you that work with this age range, I'll let you just process that for a minute. I'll say it again. The national ratio standard is 1 caregiver for every 4 toddlers, that age range being defined as 13 to 35 months. So despite working very hard within the Washington State regulations, and I think that Hayes has cultivated a quality reputation in the South Puget Sound, we still deal with staffing challenges like high turnover rate, limited qualified applicants, and of course, caregivers deal with low wages still. So I'll move on to the next slide. And we're going to talk about a little bit about the day in the life of a toddler caregiver. From personal experience and from listening to other professionals caring for toddlers, being a caregiver of toddlers is an extremely physically and mentally demanding career. A single caregiver caring for 7 toddlers while maintaining quality standards experiences extreme pressure, especially if challenging behaviors are present. So what does a toddler caregiver do? What is a day in the life of a toddler caregiver? They are maintaining attachment relationships by nurturing children, by being warm and being consistent with those interactions. They have active supervision on their mind constantly, because the first thing that as toddlers learn to walk, the next thing they learn to do is climb. They don't always express themselves with words, sometimes they bite. So active supervision is a huge concern in a toddler classroom. There's also lots of planning, observing, and assessing children to make sure that their learning objectives are being met and that their social and emotional development is on track. There's family communication. Toddler caregivers are also expected to develop strong reciprocal relationships with family members, all while maintaining NIAC early achievers and licensing requirements. So I truly believe, that's why the little toddler caregiver has a cape on this slide, because I truly believe that they are superhumans. Toddler caregivers are superhumans. As I think we can, so all of these little bubbles you see, this all leads to situational classroom stress. It can lead to burnout, it can lead to injury. The lack of support from management, lack of time to plan curriculum and connect with families. These are all reasons that a toddler caregiver experiences high levels of stress and even might want to leave their job. Let's move on to slide number 3. It's kind of a busy slide. Part of my research was having to do a scholarly article literature review. So here's where I get to have give you guys some definitions of what I was actually studying. If we look on the left side of this slide, we see that structural equals policy. So structural characteristics of child care centers are those things that are set by the government, by DCYF, by NIAC, by Early Achievers. These are things that we can't change. We have to maintain ratio and group size. So if you look at, there's 7 little toddlers to 1 caregiver, that means that there's times 2, that would be 14 little toddlers and 2 caregivers. Those are the structural characteristics of a toddler room that influence process quality. What is process? Process equals experience. Experience of the children, experience of caregivers, and experience of families. So does structural characteristics immediately influence or impact any of the experiences happening in the room? How does it impact building trustful relationships? How does it impact mental health and well-being of children, families, and caregivers? How does it impact the emotional intelligence or development of young children who so much depend on adults to help them regulate, help them cope, help them learn language, and give them the life skills they need to be a successful learner in future classrooms? So I had to have some sort of backing when I did this research, and there's a lot of research out there that says quality childcare depends on lower ratios and lower group sizes. This means this would give caregivers the time they need to support positive social emotional relationships, to devote time to children's cognitive development, and to make sure that the caregivers themselves can maintain a stress-free environment. I did a little research on attachment theory just to make sure that that was in there. So attachment theory informs us that a young child's development depends on frequent, warm, consistent interactions with a primary caregiver. And primary caregivers are not just family members. They can be child care employees, child care staff. All of these relationships promote the foundation for social and emotional and language development for children. There was one researcher that I focused on quite a lot in my research, an Australian researcher. Her name was Tanya Bretherton, and she really looked at the theme of what is the human cost and what is the human benefit to high versus low caregiver ratios and group sizes. She uncovered conditions that encourage a caregiver's determination to stay and fight. She uncovered conditions that cause flight. So she kind of coined this. This is not her term. She didn't coin the fight or flight term, but she used these terms to describe the experience of toddler caregivers. So she found that caregivers that are dissatisfied with their jobs because of high stress, low pay, lack of positive, effective relationships, this triggers the flight response and can contribute to high turnover rates. Other caregivers decide to stay in their positions despite the low pay, but because they feel supported with professional relationships and they feel connected to children and families. Okay, remember, if you have any questions, please jot them down and we'll address them at the end, because I anticipate people probably do have questions that I'm not. The paper was 51 pages long, so I couldn't put all of it in this presentation. Okay, moving on to methods. So I couldn't have asked for a better situation to study. During fall quarter, from September to December, we only had 7 children enrolled in our 2-year-old classroom. 7 children, 2 caregivers, and 1 floater. What an amazing situation, right? Just ask Natalie and Shadow, or Natalie and Mesa. Winter quarter, that doubled. We had 14 children, 2 caregivers, and 1 floater. So like I said, that was a perfect situation to discover any influences on the experience of children, families, and caregivers based on really doubling that ratio. Some of the things or the methods I used to measure process quality were video observation and reflective meetings. I analyzed the injury rate. I used the class observation to score interactions. And I also interviewed caregivers and family members. So those were the methods that I determined that would help me answer that question: can process quality be influenced by by changes in structural characteristics? All right. So here is some of the findings. Here's the facts of the situation. The fall quarter themes that emerged from the video observation, it was really clear on the video that caregivers were giving children a really strong sense of security. You could literally see on the video where children would, they would go up to their caregiver, they'd make eye contact, they'd have this moment of quality feedback and shared focus. Then children would wander off, do their own thing, and then they'd circle back to their caregiver. Caregivers stayed in one spot for long periods of time. Excuse me. They stayed down at the child's level for long periods of time. And this allowed them to build a really strong sense of security for children. You could also see on the video that whenever a child was upset, caregivers offered an immediate response. They got down at their eye level, active listening. They were concerned what was making the child upset, and they did their best to help them solve the situation. And then the last thing was just that shared focus. The video clearly showed that caregivers were sharing learning focus with children through books, through songs, through materials, through art. Caregivers were very invested in what children were doing. The injury rate for fall quarter, please discount September and December. There were not enough days to really pick up a trend there. But if we look at the trend from October to November, injuries decreased by half, both accident and conflict injuries. Jumping over to, remember, these are just the facts of the findings. We'll get into the discussion later. Jumping over to winter quarter themes, you could definitely see that caregivers focused much more of their attention on supervision and safety and conflict resolution. Caregivers were standing up more of the time, they were moving around more of the time, and as a result, they spent less time engaged in learning opportunities, less time engaged in shared focus, and you can kind of think of it as the circle of security was a little bit broken because they were no longer able to be that secure base for children during winter quarter, as their focus on supervision was a priority. Looking at the injury rates, please discount March because the COVID outbreak had happened and our attendance was down. So if we just look at January and February, we again see a decreasing trend in injuries. Yes, the accidental injuries went up in February, and as a side note, that was all due to one child, an accident-prone child in the classroom in February. If you take that child's accidents out of the injury analysis, the accident injuries went down as well. So this was an unexpected finding. I did not expect injuries to drop in winter quarter. I expected to see them increase. So that was a surprising finding for myself. All right, let's go to the next slide. Continuing the findings, here is a side-by-side comparison of the fall and winter class scores. You can see that the emotional and behavior support dimension remained high for both fall and winter quarter. If you go down to the engaged support for learning, you can see where it dipped. The quality of feedback and language modeling was where scores really dipped down. That quality of feedback got a score of 5 in fall and a score of 1.5 in winter. That's a pretty big decrease. So the discussion. This is where I get to tell you how I related all of the findings together and give you some recommendations and some implications of this research. So I kind of thought of process quality as an upside down umbrella that catches all the experience from families, from children, and caregivers. Process quality equals experience, and all the people in that toddler classroom have a shared experience. They also have their individual experience. So that's how I kind of broke it up and thought about it is, what was the true process quality for each one of those groups, for caregivers, for children, and for families? In Washington State, so let's talk about caregivers first. In Washington State, there's been an ongoing effort to combine early care and early education. In 2010, the Early Care Act passed, and the development of a quality rating system was started developing, and they are now what we see in early achievers. There's been a national campaign recently from NAAC called Power to the Profession that has increased the perception of professionalism among child care employees. There's also been in our state an increased competency and skill standard focus. So more professional development, more education, more curriculum planning, more assessment, and all of these requirements sort of put workplace pressure on caregivers. But compensation, I believe compensation and administrative support still remain low. So according to Bretherton, these challenging working conditions and the low pay and the low status associated with the work can produce a flight reflex in caregivers. So my conclusion was that the price of quality, the price of process quality equals caregiver stress. The caregivers that I interviewed for this action research confirmed that high ratios and large group size can create challenging working conditions that increase their stress. During winter quarter, when the number of children enrolled doubled, both the lead and assistant caregivers reported feeling like they did not have enough time to adequately attend to their responsibilities, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. They reported feeling guilty that they didn't have enough time to spend with every child or not being able to meet the child's needs appropriately. So I feel like, or my research showed, this isn't a feeling, my research showed that caregivers shouldered much of the stress. They took on a disproportionate amount of stress related to the increase in ratio. But their intentionality, their drive to maintain quality, helped mitigate much of the negative effects that this increase in ratio and group size created. So for this quarter that I gathered data, these caregivers had a fight response. And had this research been allowed to go on longer, I'd be interested to find out how long this fight response could be maintained. Okay, moving on to the child's perception. Assessing the experience of toddlers was a little bit more difficult since I couldn't interview them. I had to rely a lot on video observation to provide evidence of how they were cared for and what their perception of quality was. And like we've talked about before, consistent, warm, nurturing care promotes secure relationships between caregivers and between children. Video observation in fall documented that this did happen. And for wintertime, the documentation showed that the exact opposite was almost happening. In fact, when I met with the caregivers, it was confirmed that their strategy for caring for children changed for in winter quarter. They actually told their work studies and their practicums to not be on the floor on their knees because that let children sit in their laps. And that did not allow, so once the child's in your lap and you get stuck was the idea, you couldn't get up fast and move to a situation where your attention was needed. So the strategy focused on safety and conflict resolution rather than physical closeness and shared attention. And this was the caregiver's way of keeping process quality high in the classroom. But it can be argued that the high ratio and large group size contributed negatively to children's effective development due to the switch in how children were cared for. And if you remember, if we go back to the other slide where the class scores were, we can see that that 1.5 that was given in instructional support, that confirms that caregivers were spending less time engaging in learning opportunities with children. And I believe that was the consequence of this increased focus on safety. Okay, family experience was a little bit more of a direct process to figure out. In this research project, I collected interview responses from 3 families. That's not a large sampling, but it had to be families that went through both fall and winter quarter. There was indicators that family members noticed caregiver stress, but overall they still reported having a positive experience and feeling like their child had a positive experience. Probably the #1 indicator of this was 2 out of the 3 families reported just an ecstatic response to injuries going down. And as a parent myself, I understand why this may be a pretty high indicator that process quality is good. When there's less injuries in a classroom, there's less incident reports. So it makes sense that two of the families really honed in on the fact that injury reports went down for winter quarter. Other positive things that family members reported on was they reported seeing more activities in winter quarter. They reported an increase in communication and relationships to an increased positive relationship to the caregivers. So the difference in family and caregiver responses, this illustrates an imbalance not only in perception, but also in experience. As a participant researcher involved in meeting with the caregivers over the course of these quarters, I would talk frequently with them about their concern for children and families and their determination to keep working so diligently to make sure that the process quality for families remained high even in winter quarter. So that was a huge concern for them. And it worked. Family experience did remain high, even though there was a notice, family members did notice that caregivers did appear to be a little bit more stressed out. All right, almost getting there. So the implications, some of the major implication themes that I pulled from my research is that it does offer examples that process quality in toddler classrooms is negatively affected by high ratios and large group sizes. Caregiver stress and burnout is a reality. Caregivers reported higher stress levels in winter quarter when the ratio was 14 toddlers to 2 caregivers. Stressful working conditions for caregivers erode mental wellness and increase susceptibility to physical injury and illness. Children's learning outcomes are jeopardized due to a decrease in planning time and classroom instruction time, and individual child supports are difficult to maintain. So this goes back to Brotherton's research, and that all of these are indicators of caregivers either being able to display a fight response or a flight response to remaining employed as a toddler caregiver. All right, so my conclusion from all of this research done over fall and winter quarter is that toddler ratios in Washington State should be lowered. I don't know what that exact number is, but they should be lower than 7 to 1. Lowering the child to caregiver ratios in Washington State would lower the amount of stress experienced by caregivers. It would take away that need to have a fight or flight response. It could increase their job satisfaction and have an effect on lowering the caregiver turnover throughout the state. This would ensure that curriculum development matches the learning needs of children and would allow caregivers to sort of equalize their focus on all aspects of caring for children. So instead of just focusing heavily on health, on safety and supervision and conflict resolution, caregivers can include more time for nurturing relationships and one-on-one attention for children that need that extra support. It would also allow them to maintain reciprocal relationships with families, with administration, and between each other. So although there were some surprising data collected and some things that I did not expect to happen, overall, the conclusion is that toddler ratios are too high in Washington State, and in order to maintain quality, they should be lowered.